This is a video about The Witness. This is a video about puzzles. This is a video about perception. This is a video about Jonathan Blow. This is a video about lines. This is a video about dreams. This is a video about time. This is a video about colors. This is a video about sounds, squares. This is a video about suns, tetrameter, accessibility, Celeste, Oppenheimer, Bright, 46, Jacks, Understand, Dots, Apples, Toki-Tori 2, Dolls, Town, Can of Worm Lasers, Simplicity, Complexity. But most of all, this is a video about me. Hi, welcome to video. My name is Amber, and oh my god, I have some strong opinions about lines. The Witness is an indie game that released in early 2016 by a company called Thekla Incorporated, which is owned by Jonathan Blow, a man who is well known for his views on the modern gaming landscape, which play a big part in how his own games turn out. The game was favoured to a very high degree, and is considered by some sources to be one of the best games of that decade, and by some to be one of the best of all time. The core gameplay experience of the game is pretty simple overall, centered around 2D puzzles presented on digital screens, the goal of each one being to draw a line from the start to the end, following certain rules that the player must learn for themselves. The game gives you no real information directly, instead challenging you to figure out the rules and mechanics as you go on, using intuition and problem solving. From that description alone, The Witness seems like a game that would be quite intriguing, one that puzzle game fans are bound to love. I consider myself to be quite a big fan of puzzle games. I've enjoyed many games that share a lot of qualities with The Witness. The problem solving, understanding mechanics well, that one moment of epiphany in a puzzle where things just happen to click. With all that being said, I can honestly say that The Witness is my least favourite video game. It's a game that I really wanted to like, but it left me feeling like it didn't want me to like it. I've held this opinion since I first played the game 8 years ago, and I've been quite open about it with friends, to the point where when I was replaying this game to get footage and also a more recent experience for the purposes of making this video, one of my friends who saw I was playing the game simply messaged me the phrase, "Uh-oh." In fact, I've had people ask me why I didn't like The Witness, because it seemed out of character for me to dislike a game like this. The Steam reviews are generally very positive, some people having hundreds of hours and saying it's a truly unique experience. But a smaller group exists with much different opinions. Puzzles range from interesting and clever to obtuse and frustrating. Tedious just to be tedious. Beautiful game, don't play it. There are many more reviews like this, people having a large range of issues with the game. Wait, I know that bird. Even outside of Steam, people have made posts and videos about why they were not impressed with the game. Probably the most popular one being Joseph Anderson's essay, The Witness, a great game that you shouldn't play. A video that I have watched and do agree with to an extent. However, my feelings on this game are complex enough to the point where I felt like I had to make a video about this, to put my thoughts out into the world, to fully figure out what it is about this game that truly does get to me this much. It's not a game that I can describe in 1 or 2 sentences. So, what was it? What was it about this critically acclaimed game that led to me feeling like this? It's best to start at the beginning. You begin in this long, dark hallway, guided towards this lone panel with a line segment on it. By interacting with it, we're able to draw the line displayed, which unlocks the door. Moving forward, we can see a second panel that's quite similar. This immediately teaches the player the utmost core mechanic of the game in a pretty fair way. We continue on to a bright and colourful area, full of grass and flowers. Now, while I've already said that I don't like the game as a whole, I will not deny that it looks incredible. A lot of clear thought and work went into designing the layout of the game's world to look incredible, something we'll see a lot more of as this video goes on. We led to a third panel with a simple puzzle on it, get from the start to the end, just with some other directions to go this time. Once it's solved, we get a completely wordless lesson about the fact that once you solve a puzzle, generally it will lead to something else. The cable coming out of the panel lights up, and if we follow that cable, we'll see another puzzle to do. If we get curious, we can keep following these cables to find deactivated panels, ones which will light up as we solve the current ones. Realistically, any video game is going to start with a tutorial area like this, and I feel like this is a pretty well done one. When a core gimmick in the game is the fact that no information is really given to you explicitly, the fact that this tutorial area is still extremely clearly laid out is a pretty good accomplishment. However, that does break down a tiny bit once we escape from the tutorial area, because this is an open world game. There's absolutely no certainty that people are going to be going the same direction at this point. And this is a problem because realistically, we don't really know anything about how to solve puzzles yet. So how about we just start by looking at where the game probably wants us to go. This door. This puzzle is quite large and a bit complex. There are symbols on this panel, and we don't really know what they could mean yet. From what I can gather, this is intentional. It's the game trying to teach us that sometimes we might encounter a puzzle, but we don't actually know how to solve it yet. And we won't be able to find the answer until we level up our brains. I say level up our brains because that's kind of exactly what happens in a game like this. In an action-based video game, for example, you may level up and get more powerful from getting experience points, or power-ups, new equipment, and so on. While it might be possible for some people to defeat an endgame boss with just what you're given in the beginning, that's not the case for most, and you'll need to increase your power as you become more skilled at the game in order to beat bosses and progress. The Witness has that layout in a slightly different way, where there are many puzzles that you might encounter and think, I don't know what the answer could be, but that's because you need to go elsewhere and learn how to solve them. You gain knowledge about different mechanics and start to see solutions where you previously only saw problems. It's like a Metroidvania, but for your brain. A Metroidbrania. I did not invent that term, by the way. It was actually a term that, to my best knowledge, was coined by Nick Sutner, a self-described video games fella, in reference to The Witness.
So many aha moments.
Got a word
game.
for it. Metroidbrania.
Oh my god. Get out of here.
It's like Metroidvania for your brain. We're like, you learn this stuff.
No,
and then
I
go
got
back
it,
to
Nick.
previous areas.
We got it, Nick.
Yeah.
If we go back to that door puzzle, we just don't know how to solve it yet. We can try, and maybe guess what these symbols mean, but we're meant to give up, and keep walking until we encounter this nearly empty field, populated only by 2 rows of puzzle panels. The first one shows us those black and white squares, in smaller grids, allowing us to use a bit of trial and error, and a bit of intuition, to realise that we need to keep the black and white squares separated with our line. The other row lets us experiment with the hexagonal dots, and eventually realise that we need to cover them with our line. Not only are these mechanics taught to us with simpler panels, but we're given enough of a chance to understand them quite well. So, with that knowledge, we can go back to that panel from earlier, and solve it, now that we know what we're meant to do here. But remember, that's just what's intended. Like I said, the game's nature does break down a bit here. And part of that is the fact that the door isn't impossible to solve. Separating squares of different colours isn't a complex mechanic. Similar can be said about the dots, seeing them drawn on the grid path, especially when we've already seen breaks in the path before. It makes sense that their purpose is to be covered by the line. Now, I don't at all think that most people would stay at this puzzle for long enough to just understand the rules and figure it out. But when enough people can, it slightly undermines the journey that the game wants you to go on here. Now, sure, I don't have proof that anyone has been able to do this without seeing the field panels, but no wait, actually yes I do. Cracking the Cryptic is a YouTube channel known for solving cryptic puzzles, usually Sudoku based in nature.
Bobbins.
And a few years back, Simon, one of the owners of the channel, live streamed the game, and figured out this puzzle with no prior knowledge of the game or its mechanics at all. Sure, this is a guy who solves puzzles constantly, but this is a puzzle game. It's kind of made for people like that. Also, some people are persistent enough to keep trying even when they don't know the rules. You might say, well, they're playing the game wrong. They shouldn't be trying so hard when they don't actually know how the puzzle works. Hey, no. This is a game where you're told nothing. You don't know when a panel is meant to be difficult or easy. The game doesn't say, hey, stop that, maybe you should come back here later. The people working on the game seem to be very intent on the player knowing nothing for certain, and changing this would go against that. So I fully believe that a game like this can't be played wrong. People are going to do things in different ways, so a puzzle in this state just feels a bit weird to me. Of course, I haven't even mentioned the other possibility. possibility that you don't see the door puzzle, or the panels in the field, or both. It's an open world. You don't have to follow this slight path. You can go other ways. One place that is quite easy to reach is the town, an area that is basically in the middle of the whole island. A place with a large variety of puzzles, ones with symbols that the player isn't going to recognize, ones that won't make any sense. Now, I've already talked about the Vault trying to teach the player that sometimes they won't have the answers yet, but we're in a universe where we didn't get that info. Now we're seeing basically everything the game could offer us all at once without any context. It's just a lot that the player won't understand. There's a chance that you might be able to figure out some of these segments, but probably not much. Some mechanics are a bit too complex to get from nothing. If you come here early, you're basically being shown how much you don't know. And I think that's a bit of an issue. I think that most people have a natural urge to want to understand the things in the games they play. If we see something that we clearly don't understand, we'll want to figure it out. I'm sure some people will go to the town and just think, okay, I guess I just have to come back here later once I know more. But for others, it could end up being more of a fixation. You might keep thinking, okay, now I can finally solve that puzzle from earlier after you learn a new mechanic. You might try and seek out certain parts of the game just to try and understand a mechanic that you don't really get. Your playstyle becomes less natural because it's focused on this part of the game that you probably shouldn't have seen that early on. You're trudging down an unclear linear path, dictated by desire, in a game that wants nothing of the sort. And yes, I sort of got caught in this a bit when I first played the game. I would see symbols I didn't understand, and think, well, I don't know how to solve this, but now that I've seen this puzzle, I need to solve this puzzle. Because really, it's not abnormal for people to want there to be some type of order to how they're figuring things out. Sure, we don't have to, but order is natural. It's good at times. It just doesn't feel right for this area to be accessible so early on. It's a test of what we've learned in every other part of the game, but when you reach that early, it really doesn't feel like that. Instead, it's more of a constant reminder of what we haven't yet done in the game. To put it more simply, when this is a game about learning things from nothing, it doesn't feel right to know about the things you don't know. It takes out some of the mystery. Instead of a feeling of, oh, what's this? A new thing to learn, it's, okay, finally, now I can learn what these are about. There's another game that I feel is a lot better about this. One where you'll go through an area not knowing about a mechanic, but then you'll look at it completely differently once you do learn it, because your view of things has completely changed. You're not going through thinking, I don't know how to do this thing. You're going through not even realizing that doing that thing is an option. This game came out a few years before The Witness, and is probably my favourite game in this Metroidvania style. It's called Tokitori 2, and despite its appearance looking a bit like a mobile game, it's a lot more complex, and the puzzles are incredible. Your abilities in this game are limited. You can go left or right, climb up and down, and then there are two other abilities. You can tweet, and you can stomp. That's all. You don't unlock any new things. The game does a fantastic job with leading you to do things in certain ways, meaning you tend to learn the mechanics only when they're necessary to progress, so that when you go back to areas after learning more, you'll notice things that have always been there.
Welcome to the Los Pollos Hermanos.
One of the earliest examples of this is close to the beginning of the game. You'll learn some cool mechanics and start collecting these puzzle pieces. You'll follow them down a path and eventually get stuck in this pit. You can't climb or jump out, but then that bird from that review earlier appears to sing you a pleasant song with notes. Well, interestingly, we can also sing with notes, and if we sing that same song back to him... Oh, okay. So that's a rewind melody, a way of resetting back to your last checkpoint. While the game is telling you what to do, it's telling you in a way that feels natural for the game, but also it's not technically on a required path. If you know what to do, you can go straight past this. But this is all clearly by design. The game will always make it possible to go down a path if you know how, but you'll rarely know how or realise you have the tools to figure out how until much later. There were a few points where I looked at something and thought, I don't know how to get past this. But because of the nature of the game being a 2D platformer, I know a lot of the time when I encountered things like this, my thought process was, oh, I'll probably go through that roadblock from the other side. I would later discover that I was rarely ever right about that. One example is right here, also fairly early in the game. You can go to the right here, but on a first run through this area, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to, because not only does accessing this right hand path require knowledge of the game mechanics that you haven't experienced yet, but it also requires the knowledge of this path split existing in the first place. That is to say, there are things you need to prepare in the area before falling down here, things that you most likely would not set up without the knowledge that this section exists at all. I'm being vague, yes, but that's because a lot of the puzzles in this game still wow me in so many ways, and I think it's worth experiencing them for yourself if you're interested in this game at all. This, like The Witness, is a game that is completely different if you decide to replay it after completing it the first time. Since you'll already know about most of the key mechanics, you can't just unlearn everything. But there's a key difference. With The Witness, since it's an open world, the order in which you do things does not matter too much. Going through areas differently on a second run fundamentally changes very little, and realistically the only roadblocks you will face are in cases where a puzzle is a bit tricky to solve. You won't experience turmoil because you have no clue how a puzzle might work. With Tokitori 2, you can play the game completely differently, skipping areas entirely. In fact, there's an achievement for beating the whole game without ever going to the town, which is a key area in the game considering that it's basically where the goal of the game is established. A first time player should and probably will go there, but a second time player won't need to. I do know that I am comparing a 2D game to a 3D game here, and a 2D game, especially one like Tokitori 2, is bound to be a bit more restrictive in terms of where you can go, even for an open world game. Now, I don't think this makes a huge difference, because The Witness could always be a little more closed off than it is. Just because it's an open world game doesn't mean everything has to be completely open. There could be areas that are a little more locked off than they are. Because of how different this game is, and how it's structured in a way so that you are generally unaware of the things you don't know about, the revelations in Tokitori 2 generally feel really gratifying. It actively encourages you to wonder how to reach other areas, and it actually congratulates you in a way for figuring out how to reach some of these less obvious parts, via playing this small tune. It feels like the game is saying, good job, you solved a puzzle that probably took a while to figure out. When you look at The Witness and how it handles its revelations, if you're learning about something for the first time, it can end up being a drawn out process for the epiphany to happen, which isn't bad necessarily, but it does affect that moment of realization. Or you're learning about something that you already knew was foreign knowledge, in which case you probably have a good idea of what you should revisit. And I don't think I'm alone in thinking that this is overall less satisfying for puzzle solving. Let's return to just The Witness now. I've talked about the general mechanics a bit, and how we can be introduced to separating squares and going over dots. But there are a few more mechanics we should look at, other things that the game has to teach us about so that we can solve these more complex panels. If we go past the field from earlier, we'll run into a new area, or more so 2 areas, themed around symmetry. Selecting a starting dot will also cause a mirror image of itself to appear, both lines needing to be valid for a puzzle to be completed. These early puzzles are simple, just making sure that we fully get how this mechanic works before anything new is really added to it. Speaking of anything new, we can go over to Symmetry Island. These puzzles add in the black dots, meaning that you have to make sure that your 2 lines end up covering every dot in the grid, requiring a little bit of reflectional thinking. This is increased with the next section, where each line is a different colour, with the dots matching one of the 2. As you could probably guess, dots must be covered by the line with the matching colour. This gets increased further in the 3rd section, where the yellow line eventually becomes transparent, meaning that you have to rely on your mental abilities to figure out what to do, or you can use a pen and paper. You're better off using the pen and paper, to be honest. Given that this is an area that they want you to find kind of early on, this is a fair build-up. Another area you'll probably find early on is the quarry, and it bugs me. It's pretty easy to see how to access this place. There are staircases around, and an entry point that you're kind of led to if you're following the set path after Symmetry Island. The first entry door is nothing new, but the second one is. We haven't seen this mechanic before, so maybe we should go seek it out somewhere else to learn how it works. Do you get why the town bothered me? It feels weird to be sort of led to an area and immediately see something brand new after something that we already do know about. In some sense, it feels like the game is trying to tell us that we should know about this, but we don't. but also we do. So this is a puzzle that I remember Joseph Anderson talked about quite a bit in his video, so I don't want to step on his toes too much. But while you can argue that this puzzle in an introductory area shouldn't make us, the player, think that it's introducing us to these blocks as a mechanic, because we haven't seen a very clear here's what these are section for them yet. Because this game tells us nothing, we don't really know that. We don't know that we're going to get a cleared tutorial path in every single area. It's a puzzle that I feel is in a grey area, because it's complex enough to not be obvious when you're seeing the blocks for the first time, but it's simple enough for us to look at this and immediately know what these blocks are meant to represent. It's not difficult, you just need to draw those shapes with your line in the grid. I instantly knew that's what was meant to be going on here, because I didn't see a way it could be anything else. In fact, I think it's fair for someone to look at this puzzle and expect that the quarry is going to teach us about these blocks, because we haven't been in the quarry yet. We don't know that the puzzles aren't about that primarily. Going to the marsh, the area where we actually learn about these blocks, will help us understand them a little better and make it easier for the answer to this panel to jump out at us. But like with the vault, that's not required, it just makes this more difficult. I don't have much to say about the actual contents of the quarry though, because honestly, the mechanic introduced here barely shows up again at all in the game. In fact, it shows up less than 10 times after this area at all if my count is correct. It can feel like this area mostly exists to justify itself as a result. These jack-like symbols are only valid if they are in an area with exactly one mistake. The puzzle will briefly appear to be wrong, but then the jack will nullify an element, switching the puzzle to being correct. This can be a hard mechanic to wrap your head around, but the area does a pretty good job of making sure you understand how to use it, only for it to go largely unused outside of here. The marsh, as I've already mentioned, introduces these blocks, and you have to draw an area that matches their shape. Now, these symbols can get a little complex, with a few different variations that you'll encounter. Multiple shapes can be in the same area if the shape can fit both, and some shapes can be rotated within their areas. And eventually you'll see anti-squares, which must be subtracted from the main shapes if they share an area. That last point is, again, something that does not appear much outside of this area, but maybe it should. Like maybe that quarry door would be a much clearer case of you don't know this yet if they were included on it. The final area to introduce us to a new symbol is the treehouse, which has us learning about these sun symbols. These are a more complex symbol to understand, one that I feel is a good litmus test for how far you are in the game. It takes a lot to get your head around these, and this mechanic can't easily be guessed. You see, each sun has to share an area with exactly one other sun for a puzzle to be valid. That can go from 0 to 100 very quickly, and it does, introducing a lot of small what-abouts to that rule. What about pairs of suns with different colours? Well, those are compatible. What about if there's an odd number of suns? Well, suns can be paired with a different element of the same colour, as long as those two elements still only make a pair. It has more puzzles than any other area of the game, which makes sense for a mechanic with so many intricacies and exceptions. The game wants you to understand suns quite well, they do show up a lot in the endgame. But is that everything that the game has to offer? Are there other mechanics that we might encounter on these panels? Well, yes. There's one more, and it's the only mechanic that really felt gratifying to figure out. If you have a keen eye while you're exploring, you may notice these discarded panels on the ground around the island. These feature triangles, hope you remembered them. There's no set area for these, you're just meant to encounter them as you explore, with no real set order. Figuring out the rule for these will probably feature a bit more trial and error. There's no beginner puzzle to look back at, no solid progression where you'll eventually think, oh, I see the connection now. Each set of triangles must be adjacent to a number of line segments equal to the number of triangles shown. So 2 triangles here means that 2 sides must have lines drawn. 3 means 3, you get the picture. If you've seen a Slitherlink puzzle before, you may recognise this idea. These triangles don't show up in any real point in the main game, only appearing quite late in the game, where they lead to optional content if you're able to solve a puzzle with them. I'll talk more about that optional content later, but I respect the game a lot for having a secret symbol, and having it lead to a bonus area of sorts to reward your attentiveness. So is there a real problem with the symbols? Well, there are a variety of problems. We have the blocks, which are too easy to figure out the core idea of without actually experiencing the tutorials for them. In fact, in my first playthrough, the marsh was one of the last areas I found, which meant that I actually got through it fairly quickly once I did find it, because the blocks are quite common, so I was already pretty used to them by that point. You have the jacks, which barely exist outside of their main area, which kinda sucks. When you devote a whole area of the game to a mechanic, and so much of the game feels like it's there to teach you about the mechanics that you'll use, barely using one just doesn't feel right to me. We have the suns, which, while they are the most complex, basically force the game to spend the most time on them, because otherwise there's a clear risk of the player just not understanding how they work. With the triangles, it's hard for me to see a real issue with those. They exist for those who are perceptive, and then they reward that perceptiveness. There's also the fact that every new mechanic, other than the triangles, is basically taught in the exact same way. You'll get a few puzzles where there aren't really many options for what the answer could be, so by the time you get to larger ones, you probably already have a good idea of what the symbols denote. The moments of understanding are a lot more like, oh, I see. There isn't much room to experiment, and the actual rules don't really reward experimentation anyway. That brings me to another game, a game called Understand. From what I can tell, it was very inspired by The Witness, specifically the idea of figuring out the rules from unclear instructions. Except you don't learn these rules to implement them later. Each level gives you a collection of puzzles, increasing in difficulty, all of these puzzles sharing a unique rule set. Each rule is not given explicitly, only represented by the dots at the bottom of the screen. If you draw a line that fits a rule, it gets filled in. If your line follows every rule, you beat the puzzle. The rules are constantly shifting. You'll need to look at the lines, the grid, and the rules, and gain a clear understanding of what each rule means. In the final puzzle of each level, you won't be told what rules are being broken, you'll only know if your solution follows them all. Because the game is purely about finding the rules, and each level is distinct, it allows for a lot more creativity and variety in what the rules can be. Rules will get more complex, you might need to try a ton of possibilities until you can settle on an answer that fits. And even then, it could end up being wrong. It wants you to try anything, when The Witness pushes you more towards just putting in what the answer is in its tutorials, and saying, yeah, understand it, then keep going. That's a pretty subtle difference, yes, but it's enough for the games to have very different vibes. Let's look at a simple understand puzzle first. The first one in the game. 2 rules. And we can experiment after being given our first answer. We start by going from a circle to a square. Rule 1 seems to be that we started a circle. Rule 2 seems to be that we ended a square. Very simple, of course. Let's try a later puzzle, this time with 4 rules. We'll start by going from a circle to a circle, avoiding the square. Going through the square breaks rule 3. In fact, it seems to be the only thing that breaks rule 3. So rule 3 is probably to avoid the squares then. Like with the last puzzle, rules 1 and 2 seem to be about starting and ending at certain shapes. In this case, it's a circle for both. What about rule 4? Well, it seems like it only works if the squares are separated. Maybe it's about keeping the squares apart. Going forward, that seems to hold true. Let's try one more, a more complex one from later in the game. Rule 1 seems to be that you have to hit all of the triangles. Rule 2 seems to be that you must end on an empty space, but that doesn't quite hold up. Rule 2 only works when you leave a triangle square in the direction it's pointing. And rule 3, definitely the toughest one to figure out. Interestingly, it works here when the rest is unfinished. If you try for long enough, you'll eventually figure out that the line is meant to continue from a triangle until it hits a wall of some kind. The border, or the line itself mayhaps. It gets complex, clearly. But you couldn't really do complexity like this in The Witness. The symbols are pretty rigid, and the rules have to be more simple, because the game isn't set up in a way that allows you to know if an answer is only partially correct in that same way. The whole game would have to be set up completely differently for this to work, but then the whole game would be changed. Before going fully back to The Witness, I do want to appreciate a fun thing that Understand does, where each world has a special set of puzzles, where the rules are funky. You're meant to think outside of the box, in this case literally. There's a trollish element to many of these, but they break the slight monotony of the main puzzles, giving you a sometimes fun, sometimes devious, and sometimes comic reliefy break from the main game, which is another thing we don't really see in The Witness. My favourite puzzle from the game is in one of these sections, and I might be the only person who likes it. This puzzle has a single answer, and you need to utilise a core quirk of the game to be able to understand how to reach it. I love how it's done, even if it's a little frustrating in essence. So all in all, yes, there are some issues with what we see on the panels, but that's just the game. It's not like there are other ways to solve puzzles, right? Now, with how big this island is, it shouldn't be a big surprise that there are areas that I haven't really brought up yet. These areas are quite different to what we've seen before, as the mechanics aren't really as dependent on what we see on the panels. Let's go back to Symmetry Island quickly, where we can see some panels with no clear rules. These are here to teach us the basics of a mechanic that we'll see quite a lot, that the environment sometimes will help us find the solution. In this case, we can see through the panels to see these rock pillars in the background, and outlining them correctly will complete the puzzle. For a puzzle that's most likely going to be introducing us to this concept, it feels well done. You just need to notice what's happening in the background. There's an alternative to this though. On the way to Symmetry Island, you may encounter this orchard, filled with cherry blossoms and 5 normal trees. The panels also have a tree-like appearance, and a lot of endpoints. The game wants you to notice what's different about the normal trees. That being that they're green, like the panels, and each one has an apple. Now on a panel, if a line goes to the endpoint that has an apple on it, then it's solved. The game wants you to spend time understanding why puzzles like this work, and that the answer is sometimes outside the puzzle, which leads into my issue with puzzles like these. The puzzle is not actually figuring out a valid path. The puzzle is just find where the answer has been written down, then input it. Really, the only roadblock with these is finding out how a puzzle has been written into the world around you, after which you basically have the answer to every further puzzle in that area. For example, the desert, featuring these hexagon panels. I spent quite a while here on my first run through the game, not really getting what was expected of me, until I got the sun to reflect off the first panel, revealing the literal answer to the puzzle just displayed on top of it. The puzzle here is figuring out the right place to stand to be told what to do. This doesn't really feel satisfying. The only roadblock is figuring out that this is the method to finding the answer, and then after that, this area felt very monotonous and sometimes annoying, because there wasn't a lot of potential for actually interesting twists to be made on this idea. See a panel, move to get the light to reflect, and then input what was shown to you. The few things that did get added were very minor, like controllable light sources, or this big room where you have to control the water level in order to see the reflections. Something that is not engaging from a puzzle solving perspective. I want to see a puzzle and think I need to figure this out. Not, I see a puzzle and think I need to find out where they wrote the answer. The forest is another clear example of this problem. The beginning area will show you panels with shadows over them, and assuming you notice these, it's easy to figure out that you just need to draw a line that avoids the shadows. The answer isn't clearly spelled out to you, but there's really only one way to look at these puzzles. So how did the difficulty here increase? By just making it harder to see what the answer is. The beginning area eventually introduces shadows that must be ignored, or removed to be able to follow just the tree shadows. It's just obfuscation, the answer to the puzzles being slightly more unclear, instead of the puzzles themselves being harder to figure out. Instead of a difficulty curve, it just feels like you're getting easy puzzles with more and more hurdles in front of them. Take for example the next section, where it's extremely obvious what the path is. There's no ifs or buts about which way to go, but the shadow isn't always cast directly onto the panel, meaning you might have to write part of it down, or just mentally add the parts together. Failing a puzzle like this doesn't point to a lack of understanding of mechanics. Rather, it shows a slight misunderstanding of the thing the game wrote down, which is understandable when they're obscuring things like this. You don't feel like, oh, okay, I see what I did, let me try figure that out. You think, oh, let me try reading the answer again. This one is written on the fences next to the panel. The only difficulty comes from actually reading the spaces in the line. The difficulty curve is artificial. The final section bothers me even more somehow. It's a twist. Now you have to follow the shadows. So now the answer is literally just written on the panel. Then there's the second one. Okay, so we need to follow the idea of the line, but we don't need to stay in the shadows. That was not how the rest of the area worked, but okay. This one is the same, but a bit more abstract. Don't like that. Then this one. I get the joke. The branch is broken, you can't actually go that way. But to teach people, you just basically need to follow the shadows, not stay directly inside them. And then have the solution be, you don't need to follow the shadow, you need to stay completely inside of it at the last moment. That feels kinda cheap. It's not difficult logic or puzzling. It's a cheap trick that goes against what the area just taught you. Another big issue is that each area with this concept introduces a slightly new way to use the environment to get an answer to a puzzle, but we don't really see many puzzles that utilize the environment outside of these ways to get the answer to a puzzle. An area like these will give us a couple of examples of things to look out for, and then in the town section we'll see a puzzle or two using that, but that's it. We don't really get many puzzles asking us to look towards the environment in very unique ways. That is, outside of the keep. The keep has 4 mazes, and each has a different method method to find the solution. 3 of these are pretty cool. The first one has us retrace our path through the maze, making sure that we take the block paths into account, despite them not appearing on the panel. The second is about the ground we walk on. You may notice some paths have longer grass growing. If we trace a path that avoids that long grass, we beat the puzzle. The final one is really cool though. You may notice that nothing is really out of place here, except the panel itself. The panel displays a different maze layout to the one you walk through. Some paths are in common for both, and if you trace a line that follows the paths that only appear in both, then you'll beat the puzzle. These are good environmental puzzles, and while the second one does sort of appear again in the town, it's not like the area specifically primed you to look for that stuff. So my main point has been that a big weakness in puzzles based around the game world is that it's just giving you the answer. Is there a way to fix that? Have things work a bit better mayhaps? Well, yeah. Let's have a look at Taiji, a game that was inspired by The Witness, which is clear from its general layout and concept. Some puzzles are about mechanics on a grid layout, some are about looking towards the environment. It does suffer from some of the issues I've just talked about here, how having an environment hold a puzzle's answer can just be a case of, the answer is already written out, just notice it, or figure out how to read it when it's been obfuscated. But there's an area in this game that does something that is so good that I managed to implant a false memory in my brain about. It's something that I thought The Witness did, but evidently it didn't. At least in this way. And I'm a little surprised that it didn't, because it feels like a very logical step to take for a game like this. This will involve a few spoilers for Taiji, so if you don't want to hear that, go ahead and skip to the next section. This area is a museum, displaying different art pieces, some recognizable, some not. This is an area about using art pieces to solve puzzles, and sometimes the answer is given to you in a way where you have to decipher it, like I've just complained about in The Witness. But then with paintings like these, what are you meant to do? Well, the realization you have to come to here is incredible. Other puzzles in this area are about light and dark panels, so you may think that's what you're meant to focus on, but if you've played through most of the rest of the game, you may notice details. There are diamonds around the snowman, and small dots across him, which look like symbols seen in other parts of the game. We have to take note of the symbols in the paintings and make a solution that takes them into account. Instead of the answer being obscured, it's the path to the solution that's been obscured, which is marginally better in my opinion. If there were puzzles like this in The Witness, you combine the small positive aspects of hiding the answers in the environment with the act of actually solving a puzzle. I think The Witness can be improved a fair bit by having stuff like this in store. Also, looking back at Taiji, and how I discussed Tokitori 2, if you go to this area early on, will you understand the puzzles here? No. Will you know why? Also no. You're not going to recognize these symbols as puzzle pieces until you actually experience them. The town tells you exactly what you don't know. The museum doesn't make it quite as clear. So very quickly, despite my complaints about these environmental puzzles, the one thing I will give them is that they're pretty clear. If you've done something wrong, then no matter what, there is a way to justify why it's wrong, based on how the answer is written. It might be a slight issue of perspective, or a detail that wasn't noticed. But everyone who sees these puzzles will have the potential to figure out them eventually. Everyone. Everyone.
Court is now back in session, continuing the case of the People versus Video Game.
Your Honor, I'd like to invite the witness to the stand.
Witness?
Now, Miss Amber, don't you think saying you hate the witness is a bit harsh?
It's just my opinion on the game. I think I have a right to express it.
Be that as it may, have you considered that you're wrong?
What?
Have you considered that your opinion is wrong?
Do you know what an opinion is?
I'm fully aware. However, I don't think you can claim a game is purely bad when that's just what you think.
I don't think I'm claiming that it's purely bad. I'm just trying to explain why it's not something I can bring myself to like. I doubt I'm the only person who feels that way.
Why does this even bother you this much? What's the purpose of getting up onto a soapbox to proclaim how you can't stand the game's experience?
That feels a bit reductive.
No, let's think about it. The game didn't do anything to you. Is there really anything that you can say is a problem with this game? Or are you just needlessly spreading hate?
How is it spreading hate? I just felt that the game has problems and wanted to discuss that.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. Mr. Smith, control your client.
I can't believe they just said that to me.
So, it's flawed, huh? Is that another of your opinions? Do you have anything that can't hide behind the shield of subjectivity? This is a court of law!
No, there's something. Something quite important, actually.
Well?
Can someone get that bird to shut up?
What bird?
That bird.
I don't hear a bird.
It's right. It's... Can someone get that bird to Look, everything I've discussed up until this point is realistically just my opinion. The things I take issue with here may easily just not bother someone else. Some people will not have any issues with these environmental puzzles, and find the act of simply finding the exact answer to be a gratifying puzzle in itself. They might feel completely differently about the ways you understand the symbols, or find that the town is not flawed for being an area that you can stumble upon very early in the game. There's nothing wrong with these opinions, they're just ones that I do not share. And after all, this is a video mostly about my experience with this and similar games. Some people are going to watch this, look at what I have to say, and think, I don't agree. And if they're respectful, it'll stop there, and they won't feel the need to chastise me for disagreeing with them about a video game that came out 8 years ago. Though I do see that watching a video where someone disagrees with you for this long is not exactly fun. The reason I talk about this is because there are a few areas of the game that I haven't brought up yet. And these are the areas that I feel the strongest about. Not only that, but to an extent, I feel like it would be disrespectful to argue against some of the points I'm going to be bringing up in this section. Let's start by going towards the mountain, to an area of the island known as the greenhouse, which is actually white, so they're lying. It builds upon the concept of separating squares by colour. There's a very high chance that by the time we reach this area, we'll be familiar with this rule, as the greenhouse is on the far side of the island compared to where we start, and a lot of areas do use the separating squares rule. I would argue that most people wouldn't have too many issues with these early puzzles, and in fact, I would argue that around 95% of people wouldn't have any issues with the second set either. But why 95%? That's somewhat specific. Well, there's a good reason. Let's take the role of someone who might be in that 5% of people. So, why is this happening? Why are around 5% of people inputting what are clearly wrong answers? You may have already guessed it, but around 5% of people on Earth are colorblind. This area can be a complete hellscape for people with colorblindness. Generally, when the squares have appeared before, they are shown using very contrasting colors, black and white, pink and green, but here we see different combinations. Combinations that feel like they were chosen with very little regard for people who struggle with distinguishing between different colours. Even with full colour vision, the purple squares in the first row can blend in a little bit with the blue background, but with a form of red-green colourblindness, they may stick out even less, being more of a struggle to identify. The second set almost feels intentionally poorly planned. The blue and magenta are extremely close for those with protanopia, and on the flip side, the cream and yellow are far closer than they should be with tritanopia. Moving on to part 2, we see a puzzle that is impossible at first glance. And luckily, it doesn't look a lot more possible if colour vision is impaired. But since the game tells you nothing, someone with colour blindness might just think they're being fucked with, especially after the previous puzzles they went through. The actual answer is to view the puzzle through this yellow screen, or this gold screen, or this white screen, at which point the colours will look different. Different enough for a valid answer to be input. In a sense, it's similar to something I talked about a bit earlier, with the environment giving us an idea of how to look at a grid, instead of just the answer. But did they really have to do it with colours? This game in no way signifies that if you are colorblind, you'll probably struggle with this section. The game doesn't say colorblind players may have difficulties or anything like that. People will get to this point without any knowledge that this game was designed with very little regard for their eventual struggle. That's an extreme point, yes, but it's been 8 years and there's still nothing on the game's page to even denote that people might have trouble with this. This is the type of thing worth bringing up. We see colored glass come into play again with this blue/clear screen here. Really? It looks completely clear. This was really badly planned, my guy. This section with the magenta, grey, blue, red light is fun enough, but then we reach the elevator, featuring puzzles based around understanding how RGB lighting works and will affect the colored squares. You specifically have to predict the answer to a puzzle you cannot view based on the knowledge you gain from the first 4 floors. Something which is already difficult if you can see the panel correctly, but throw in a fundamental wall between your eyes and your understanding of colour. I don't think I get how they could have designed this area unless they completely disregarded the existence of colourblindness. It feels like they just decided to ignore it. I don't think an issue like this should be ignored. It's denying part of the experience to a significant part of the population. It's also worth mentioning that the orchard area suffers from this issue as well. The red apple in the green tree is not going to stand out much at all to someone with red-green colourblindness, meaning that some will struggle to reach the epiphany moment that this game wants you to have here. This issue is second place to another area in the game though, an area where the issue, in my mind, has 3 different layers to it. The jungle, mostly featuring panels that look like this. When I first got to this area, I was completely lost. I didn't know what the game wanted me to look for. I solved the first panel through a bit of trial and error, but then the second panel made no sense as well. I looked around for something, anything to latch onto, and eventually, after I felt like I had exhausted my options, I did look up the area to find out what I was missing. Now, finding out what I was missing here was not fun. It was one of the earliest signs to me that I was not going to have a positive experience with this game. In fact, it felt like the game was trying to tell me, you're playing this wrong. So, what's going on here? It's not great. It's birds. If you listen to the bird tweets that play in this area, you may notice a high note, then a low note. So if you try going up, then down, to match that, then that's the solution. Your answers to the panels are based on the pitches of the sounds that play in this area. So why did that suck so much for me when I first played? Well, obviously, I had no knowledge that there would be a sound-based area in this game. There had been no music in the game at all, just sound effects of the waves, the winds, the panels, and the character taking steps. So, what did I do? I listened to music while I played, because I like listening to music. I'm someone who doesn't love sitting in silence. We're not a rare breed. People listen to podcasts on public transport, they'll listen to Spotify while they write. I'm listening to the Celeste soundtrack while I'm writing this section of the script even. So it makes sense that when a game gives you this little audio to work with, you might end up listening to something else to supplement that. So when I first got to the jungle, I couldn't hear the birds. I didn't know there were birds to hear. You could say it's my fault, but I don't really care, because the simple fact that I listen to music while playing The Witness is not the biggest problem with this area. It's just something that stands out to me as a smaller issue. I felt like I was being told, ha, fucking idiot, you were listening to music, you're not meant to do that. It's possible to argue that the speaker should have been a clue toward the area's mechanic, but I can't be alone in thinking that this doesn't look enough like a speaker. Now, let's jump to a more pertinent issue. I couldn't hear the sounds because of music. But I could turn off the music. What about deaf people? Around 6% of people worldwide have disabling hearing loss, and nearly 20% of people having some type of hearing loss in general. These are people that may struggle a bit to take clear notice of the sounds, struggle to tell the differences between them easily, or just straight up not hear them at all. That's an incredibly clear barrier that stops these puzzles from being solved naturally. Like with the greenhouse, there's nothing to suggest that people with hearing loss will struggle. And I know mentioning that these problems exist can be a spoiler towards the fact that puzzles involving these mechanics exist at all. However, please don't argue that in good faith. There are ways to warn a player about this. There are also ways to make games that don't involve puzzles that block out a significant portion of the population. Crazy, right? The last issue I want to mention is a bit more in between in severity. Not as simple as just not noticing the sound aspect, but not as severe as not being able to engage with these puzzles entirely. This section's gimmick is just another obfuscation of a puzzle's answer. The answer is set out clearly. It's just written in the language of pitch, as opposed to a visual medium. But pitch is not something that's easy for everyone to discern, and this gets worse as the area progresses. Like, listen to this. The main way this area increases the difficulty is by adding in more sounds to disguise the answer, which can already be difficult to get. The sounds only repeat every 10 to 15 seconds, so if you think you've got something but you're not sure, it's going to be a while until you can check. Pitch can be difficult even if you do know what you're looking for here. Eventually the key sound switches to a fox to trick you before going straight back to the birds. Then there's the upper section where you need to figure out how these dots correspond to pitch, as well as figuring out the right order. Now that would be a good example of the game giving you part of the answer, but still leaving you with a puzzle to solve in the process. I say would be because, according to my footage, I was here for about 5 minutes, but it felt like 50. Having to sit alone, with all these sounds, trying to focus on the little intricacies of them, understanding the pitches of sounds and the sequence that you're meant to look for. For me at least, was too much to handle at points. Two bird songs happening at the same time, trying to figure out which sounds belong to which, and also damn figure out the pitch order and which one is correct. I felt incredibly stressed. It was harder to focus. I was agitated. These punchy, annoying sounds were giving me an auditory sensory overload. I already have some issues with processing auditory information as my brain receives it. But this area legitimately hurt to go through and figure out. I was close to tears by the end of it. And it doesn't help that this section does the really cool thing of making a panel deactivate when you input the wrong answer, meaning you have to go back and solve the previous panel again, changing the sound that's playing and breaking focus. I wanted to talk about that last because it's the most personal to me. I felt strong emotions from games in the past. I love it when a game can make me feel things. Sometimes it'll be because of the story or the characters. Sometimes just a piece of music will hit me hard, and sometimes it's the catharsis of getting through an extremely tough challenge. But this section, in the way it does things, made me feel a way that I don't think a video game should. It made me feel subpar. It made me feel like I wasn't good enough because I wasn't able to get the solution to these puzzles without breaking. I don't like that feeling. Who the fuck would? And it's not, you're not good at this super difficult thing. It's, you're not good enough to be able to solve this thing. This game is critically acclaimed, by the way. Whether or not you feel that feeling is justified from my point of view, it's how I felt. And it's one of the bigger factors in why I can't bring myself to enjoy this game, no matter how many times I've played it. Accessibility is a thing that, for a while, I didn't really think about when it came to video games. When I was younger, it took me quite a while to really understand empathetic thinking, and getting my head around experiences that I wouldn't have myself. I was of course just a kid, so I don't think it affected me too much back then. Nowadays though, I find myself thinking about accessibility quite a lot. Games should be relatively clear for people, and it'd suck to hear a lot about a game and then find out that it's difficult for you to play when similar games don't have those same issues. Puzzle games, by default, feel like they have the potential to be the most accessible kind of video game. Some of the more common puzzles people experience, like Sudoku or crosswords, basically anything in a newspaper, are basically just limited by your knowledge. You don't need quick reflexes to solve a Sudoku, good hand-eye coordination to get through a crossword. There may be slight difficulties in some circumstances, like if you have trouble holding stationary for a pretty long time, or in the digital case, issues with typing and clicking easily. But for the most part, unless timing is insanely critical, I doubt that most people would have an issue with simpler puzzle games, outside of the idea of how do you solve the puzzle. Though I will say it's possible that there are things in this section that I have not considered that would be worth bringing up. My point is, because puzzle games aren't usually bound by fast gameplay, tricky maneuvers, or things that able-bodied players might just take for granted, seeing a game completely ignore accessibility in two major ways like this, it stings. It just stings. I'm going very hard on this game at the moment, so I do want to shift gears a little bit, and talk about a game that does accessibility a lot better. Celeste. Celeste is a fast-paced platformer with some puzzly elements to it. Your main ability is that you can dash, whether it be on the ground or up to one time in midair. The game introduces a lot of mechanics that you get to learn about and play around with in a set order. Some parts are very fast-paced, requiring complex movements and strategies all in a row, and the game can get quite difficult at times. A game like this generally would not be super accessible for everyone. However, effort was put in to mitigate that at least a bit. There's an optional assist mode in the game, giving you different options to adjust your gameplay experience, letting you slow things down, meaning your reflexes don't need to be fast, giving you more dashes per jump, meaning you can course correct if you make a mistake, giving you invincibility, meaning that you can walk on surfaces that would usually kill you. Most notable to me is dash assist, which pauses the game when you try to dash, letting you specifically plan how a dash will go so you don't hit the wrong keys or start in the wrong place. A lot of games in this genre won't have settings like this that can be adjusted, meaning that players at different ability levels will have to deal with the exact same experience without being able to attune it to themselves. With Celeste, if you have difficulty with the game normally, you can just turn on assist mode, or even if you just want an easier experience with the game. I've been describing accessibility as something that is a requirement for people, but that's not always the case. Nothing is wrong with wanting a game's experience to be easier, whether it's a requirement for you or it isn't. So when we look back at The Witness and how it lacks these features, it just feels like there was too much focus put on making sure the game's experience was the same for everyone, to fully consider that not everyone will be living that same experience. That is more or less it for the main areas of this game, and I'm sure you can see why I feel they have noteworthy flaws. Now it's time to talk about the last sections of the main campaign, and how they also have noteworthy flaws. So quickly going back to the town, the panels here should make a bit more sense now that we've experienced what this game has to offer. But because all of them are essentially carbon copies of the mechanics, they aren't really used in new ways. It's just, remember that puzzle? Do it again. I don't have a lot else to add here, just like this area. The final section of the game is at the top of this mountain. Once you've beaten 7 of the 11 main areas, you'll be able to access the final challenges. You can argue that this means that the jungle and greenhouse don't need to be beaten, so it's not worth complaining about them. Don't argue that. The symbol-based mechanics are basically required though. You'll see them in this area a lot. This beginning is probably the most awkward part. You need to solve this puzzle while weaving your path around the statues. This mostly ends up being a challenge in finding the exact right place to stand for a solution to even be possible, which is not great in my opinion. It's a challenge, yes, but not one that feels good. Let's move on to the first main room. We see what is admittedly kinda cool. A puzzle that, as you solve it, draws a bridge across the empty void on this floor. You'll have to use this bridge to access the 4 puzzle areas around the room. Puzzles which all have the main gimmick of it is difficult to see the grid. Left wall, the puzzles are pretty basic, but they're offset in weird ways, which makes it just harder to see what's required. I really don't like that. It's more of the adding hurdles to an easy puzzle thing that does not a good puzzle make. The right wall is the same, but different. Black and white obstructions block your view of the puzzles. It's just annoying to solve, not really tricky. There are 2 panels in the central spire, slightly hidden in ways that force you to look from a harsh perspective, which is not too bad since they aren't obscured too much. The back section makes better use of in-world objects obscuring the panel itself, in a way that feels like a more fitting tutorial to the idea of that impeding your solving ability than what we saw outside. Solving all of these opens the next floor, with 2 ground bridge lines and a more complex puzzle to solve to activate them. Here we have puzzles that aren't great for people who are sensitive to flashing lights and colours. It's more obscuring the easy solution with annoying hurdles. Your challenge is just to figure out which squares are different from each other. I like it when my puzzle solving abilities are tested rather than my vision, so these are kinda lame. This next set is probably the strongest part though. All 6 puzzles are simple individually, but as you keep unlocking them, your solutions must be valid on every panel you have unlocked. It's a more reasonable hurdle than in other cases, because there's a bit of puzzle management at play. The lowest section has 2 parts. First is this floor puzzle, utilising the jacks for the second time since that section ended, and then using the small puzzles as symbols for this larger symmetry puzzle. Admittedly, a kind of cool thing. Lastly, we get 2 puzzles, both randomly generated, which we have to solve before they deactivate. This is a tougher challenge, but it does test our understanding of the rules and our puzzle ability in a cool way. The final room gives us these cylindrical puzzles and forces us to get used to them immediately. I don't love them, but I don't think this is bad. It's basically the only thing truly being introduced here, since everything else was at least a bit familiar. Beating all of these lets us take an elevator, which puts us into a cutscene that lasts a few minutes, flying around the island and resetting everything back to null before the game closes. We can of course load a save file and play more. If we get all 11 lasers to shine at the mountain, we can access this triangle puzzle. And if we truly learned how the triangles work across the island, we gain access to the caves, a secret bonus area for the best of solvers. Clearly the most difficult of content will show up here, right? Sort of. Most of what we find here is just riffing on the stuff we already know quite well. Block puzzles where the main gimmick you see is here are a bunch of similar puzzles with minor differences. Can you find all the different answers? This lacks innovation, which it feels like this area desperately needs. There are a few floor puzzles with beams that block your view, something which I'm kinda glad did get extended on a little bit. Some puzzles here feel like they were cut from the main section of the game, since their appearances too clearly match the areas that introduce their main mechanics. Up here we have dot puzzles. A bit tricky, I guess. There's a somewhat decent gimmick with these ones though, where the dots can only be seen once you fail the puzzle. It feels a little more innovative than the other, obscuring your ability to see the easy puzzle panels. And that's basically all for the caves, with one exception. The challenge. not the MTV one. This is the final boss of The Witness, a timed challenge. It's a gauntlet of procedurally generated puzzles that must be done in order, before the music stops. If you're good at solving the puzzles that the game has to offer, this probably won't be too hard. Even if you're not, eventually you'll get the hang of things to the point where you'll be able to get through everything. I first discovered this on my second run through of the game, and it took me around an hour to be able to solve everything. You have about 6.5 minutes to get through it all, and most of the puzzles are not too bad. Many are simple in nature, with a few tricky moments, like with these sets of 3, where you're actually only able to solve one of the 3 shown, the other 2 being impossible. As you can guess, you have to figure out which one is solvable, which can delay you a bit. There's a maze section with 2 panels to find and solve, which sounds tough, but actually an earlier puzzle in the challenge gives you the information you need to succeed here. The gauntlet ends with 2 pillar puzzles, and if you're running low on time, you'll hear the music getting more intense. Hall of the Mountain King reaching its finale as you are approaching the end, hoping you can beat the last puzzle with even just a second to spare, after who knows how many attempts. Or you can beat the whole thing way before that song even starts. It's probably one of the 2. Because of how different it is to everything else in the game, it stands out. It's a suitable challenge even when you know how to solve all the puzzles. It's arguably good, but then you do unlock something for beating this challenge. The door of this interesting structure opens. You unlock this box. And wait, no, not yet. We'll get to that in a bit. I want to talk about what we just experienced. That was the main endgame content of this game, the final challenges of the main story, and the bonus parts. So, was it good? I would expect more to really be introduced here. More twists on puzzles other than, ooh, now it's difficult to see the grid. Twists that actually make you have to rack your brain to decipher. Things that involve solving tricky endgame puzzles instead of jumping over a hurdle in order to press a button. The 6 connected panels were a good example of this, and the pillars right at the end were a cool thing to introduce us to. But then also with the caves. Only a little bit of that really felt like a bonus endgame area. It feels half fumbled and half well done, which is really not the greatest way to end things off. This is a problem with the game not having a lot of things be strictly required. They can't go too in depth with the mechanics they use because it's possible you aren't that used to them yet. A game that has the endgame be directly after everything else would be a bit more satisfying in the end, where everything from the game prior gets utilised and built upon. I wonder what game I'm talking about this time. Can of Wormholes, released last year, is another Metroidvania, and shares a lot of positive qualities with Tokitori 2. You learn more mechanics as you progress through the game, but these are things that are possible from the beginning. You just don't need them to complete these puzzles. As the game progresses, you may actually find reason to revisit old puzzles with a slightly different goal, using these newly learnt mechanics to find new answers. I'm being vague again because the revelations in this game are just impeccable. Also, basically every puzzle introduces some kind of new interaction or concept for you to use. Few puzzles in this game feel like a waste. There's a satisfying quality to every part of the game. After a lot of puzzle solving in the main game, you can reach the final world, with a large selection of puzzles. You have to use everything the game has already taught you, and learn a few new things to get through. This is fantastic. It feels worthwhile to go through the whole area. It feels like a great end to the game at large. Some of the coolest puzzles in the game lie here. When a game is set up like this, it feels like the endgame should be the most impactful part. You've been building up to it the whole time, and it just doesn't feel like that's the case with The Witness. Unless you consider purely just the challenge to be the endgame content of the game. It's a shame. That's all I can really say about it. But of course, there is more content in the game that we could talk about. So while I have shown off a bulk of the game already, there are a few things I haven't covered. And some of these are actually things that, to an extent, I do feel positively about. Now that we have knowledge of just about everything in the main game, things might feel a bit different if we go back to previous areas. If we head back to the beginning area, there's something here that a new player likely wouldn't pick up on. Something that's tough to notice, but someone with a full game of experience may think is fishy. I am obviously referring to this pillar. The endgame introduced us to puzzles on pillars, and there are symbols etched in here. We can solve this. It's a puzzle hidden in plain sight, which is really goddamn cool. How many other times is this done? Oh. It feels strange for this to be a one and done, because there's a lot of potential with secret puzzles in this form. I get that having more would have made this one feel less special, but there are definitely ways to add to this niche. And I don't really get why the game felt the need to hit the brakes here the moment they got close to something cool. There's also an area I haven't brought up yet, one that I'm sure some people are waiting for me to talk about. The Shipwreck, an area with just one puzzle, a vault door. I've seen many people refer to this as the hardest puzzle in the game, and I understand why. Just from looking at it, there's not a lot of information. Luckily, some analysis should lead you in the right direction if you look at every single detail. There are multi-sized dots, like in the sound area. Some areas are blocked off in a way that implies that there are actually two lines, like with Symmetry Island. Also, the dots come in 3 different colours: pink, orange, and black. I want to focus on the dots because no matter how many times I see this part explained, it doesn't make enough sense to me. This is meant to be a nod towards the greenhouse, the idea of the red lighting in the ship turning light blue to pink and yellow to orange. The greenhouse famously didn't even work like that. The colours weren't mixed in this way. The coloured glass screen sort of gave off a vibe of colour mixing, but in a way that doesn't really blend with what this puzzle is attempting to do. And then we have a previous example of what red light does to yellow and light blue. We get red and dark red. Why do you think this video has been red the entire time? Yellow and light blue do not become orange and magenta. So this is just a new interaction of light that I guess we're just meant to understand? One that doesn't even make sense in a real world context? I also don't even know if this is relevant, because the puzzle isn't really that affected by the dots being these specific colours. It matters more that they're just different colours to each other. But everyone always brings it up, and I don't get it. The main part of this puzzle is just listening to the ambient sounds and trying to discern the different pitches, and mapping those to the dots on the screen. I talked about my experience in the sound area, and luckily this is less overloading, but it's so much harder to properly discern even when you know what to look for. This isn't the only place in the game to have interesting ambient sounds, so people might spend a while trying to figure out what sounds they're even meant to be analysing. Past that, I've seen people talk about solving this puzzle, and showing that they needed to bring out spectrograms, video editing software, audio manipulation tactics, just to figure this out. I really don't think that things like these should be something that a lot of people are using to solve a puzzle. When things get to the level where external help is basically needed for many people for one panel in the game, maybe there's an issue with that panel. It just feels like a step too far. I was sitting in front of this door, basically just thinking that maybe I had figured out what the water droplets might sound like, but not even really knowing what the starting point was or if the pitches were right. I was basically prepared for this to feel like trial and error. I legitimately didn't know why that was a valid solution. I guess it must work based on the rules the puzzle wants you to follow, but it didn't actually feel like I understood any of what I was doing. For the most part, I was just trying to get all the dots covered, and feeling like maybe I had heard a deeper sound early on but wasn't sure about it. A puzzle of this scale should probably give you a feeling of satisfaction, like, woo, yeah, I did the thing. Well, I did the thing, but it didn't feel like I should've. Now it's time to discuss the big part of the witness that I've been waiting to talk about. In some ways, it's where I feel like the game truly shines. In other ways, it's where I feel like some of the game's weaknesses really show. Back at the top of the mountain, we'll see a solitary panel, with no real purpose. It's just a wacky line. Huh. Huh. So this is where the game's world really shows its worth. I've mentioned a lot that it's clear how much thought went into the game, and making everything appear exactly as intended. And this is the point where I can really show off how. There are over 100 hidden puzzles like this in the game, involving you finding a circular starting point somewhere in the world and following along a line to a completion, all through the design of the world around you. Some involve forced perspective, some are a little mind-blowing, and some are tedious. Very tedious. The Marsh is a big offender here, involving these platforms that move based on puzzle solutions. I do not think that these are a good mechanic. They move extremely slowly, and it feels like the justification for that is so that these hidden puzzles aren't overly difficult to complete. Except there's a fix for this. There's a boat in the witness, one you'll use a lot for these puzzles, and you can control the speed of it. You can slow down if you want to get through a puzzle easier, or speed up just to get to a location. You could just add speed control to these painful mechanisms. Allow players to get through tedium at a decent speed if they just want to explore, and let them slow things down when there's a purpose. Forced tedium is a big pet peeve for me with this game. So many things will be purposefully slow when they don't really have to be. I'm certain that there are going to be plenty of people saying that there are reasons for these things being the way that they are, or talk about Jonathan Blow's views on video games as a response. And even if you already disagree with me me, just hear me out. The majority of things you can find in The Witness have a high amount of immediacy to them. You see a panel, you can solve it right then and there. You notice a dot on the landscape, you can solve it right then and there. Some environmental puzzles are a bit trickier, meaning that the landscape may need to change slightly for the line to exist at all. By itself, that's not a problem. What I do feel is a problem is when these puzzles require you to spend multiple minutes following along a line just to get through to the end. You, as a player, have already noticed the starting point and are just waiting to get to the end point. You have, in essence, already found the answer. You're just forced to go and sit and wait for the game to catch up to you. You can say this is about patience, the game saying that things shouldn't be immediate. It's best to slow down and truly take in the world around us. Well, so much of the game isn't really about that at all. In fact, a lot of this game had this essence of, we're putting a message in here that is deeper than what you see on the surface. But where do you get these messages? From long puzzles that stand out as outliers for the wrong reasons. From these audio logs placed around the island, most of which being readings from quotes, and from films you can watch in the theatre that I'll be talking about pretty soon. With all of this game, at times, it feels... Pretentious is a word that I know a lot of people have used to describe The Witness. In fact, I'm sure that I have used the word to describe it in the past myself. It's a word used by people who felt like the game did not do much for them in terms of how this extra content played out. It's sometimes used mockingly by those who are greatly affected by the game in order to mock those who disagree with them. And it's a word that seems to have followed Jonathan Blow throughout his entire game-making career. At this point, I think it's worth talking about Blow's previous title, Braid, a highly acclaimed game that released in 2008. The concept is quite simple. It's a puzzle platformer that controls much like any old platformer. Left, right, climb, jump, the basics. But what shines about this game is the thing that sets it apart from most platformers. The mechanic of reversing time. At basically any point in a stage, you can rewind time and set everything back to the way it was, essentially letting you try difficult puzzles or jumps as many times as you need. The puzzles in this game are extremely well crafted. The new mechanics that the game introduces are done so well. It's a relatively short game, even for your first run, but it's very substantial. In addition, the graphics are beautifully done, giving the game an elegant feel. The game doesn't get stale, each world adding in a new twist on time manipulation. World 3 introducing the idea of things being immune to reversals. World 4 has time change based on your position in the stage. World 5 has us using shadow versions of ourselves to progress. And World 6 gives us a ring that slows down time considerably in a localized space. The game has a story that may seem familiar. The player character is trying to save a princess, going across different worlds, experiencing challenges, beating bosses. But the story isn't truly this simple. In a single playthrough, there's the slight vibe that something is amiss. Maybe it's from the use of language in these plot books. Maybe it's the fact that this feels a bit too familiar to other games. There's even a dinosaur to say the classic Super Mario Bros. Line. Or maybe it's the fact that the first world is titled World 2. If you go through every level and collect every puzzle piece available, then you can assemble a painting for each world. And after you've done that for all 5 of these worlds, you unlock the attic and World 1. A world where everything is happening in reverse. Something which is honestly a bit unsettling. It gives you the feeling that something is seriously wrong, until you get to the end. You see the princess escaping from the monster who kidnapped her, followed by a really engaging level where you're trying to survive, helping and being helped by her to progress, desperately trying to avoid the oncoming flames. You're getting to the game's end, about to complete your goal. You get to the end and everything stops. You can't actually do anything except to rewind. And what follows is genuinely breathtaking. The level plays in reverse, you going from right to left, and giving completely new context to what you just played through. The princess was not helping you, she was doing everything she could to stop you. It makes complete sense, since this world has been in reverse. Of course this stage was too, and especially when you remember that this was World 1. This is before everything else that happened in the game. The monster who kidnapped her was in knight in shining armor, saving her from you. The plotlines we read earlier came from the mind of an untrustworthy narrator. Now, I first played this game earlier this year, and I had been spoiled on the story before experiencing it myself. And yet my fucking jaw was still on the ground when I saw how well done this ending segment was. The game ends with some final plotline books letting you see the true mind of your character. He's not a good guy. I was only 10 years old in 2008, so I can't speak much about the state of the gaming industry when this game released. But I know it's been said that Blow aimed to deconstruct current video game trends for the time, and reveal deep moral and philosophical questions. It's also worth mentioning that I've seen people state that this was one of the more influential games when it came to indie games being taken more seriously at the time. It took close to 4 years for the game to be fully developed, and a ton of money, so it's clear that Blow was very passionate about this project. He wanted the game to send a message, and while that message isn't clearly written out, and there are a lot of ways to interpret this game, there are some things that stick out to me. The references to Super Mario Bros. Are extremely clear, potentially bringing out a message that games do not need to be much more complex than the classics to be great. There are references to the Manhattan Project. That's not a joke, they're there, including a quote from J. Robert Oppenheimer from just after the Trinity nuclear test. Now we are all sons of bitches. There are a lot of ways to interpret this as it fits into the game. The main one people see comparing the princess to the atomic bomb, and the player to their intent on creating it. This is heightened by another thing in the game that I have neglected to mention, something I haven't brought up, because the game also did not bring it up. There are a series of collectibles in this game, 8 stars, that are insanely hard to actually obtain. This game does not make it clear that they exist. They're off-screen and require going to areas that you, the player, aren't told about generally. There's no real reward for getting them all other than a feeling of completion, perhaps. I haven't actually gotten them myself. I did collect one though, since I have been made aware of it. When you're assembling World 3's puzzle, there are 2 pieces that have symbols that look like star segments. These pieces don't fit together, but if they're arranged together in just the right spot, a star will become available to you in the hub area. There's no clear sign toward this being a thing, and if you solve the puzzle before doing this, well, you just can't get the star ever then without restarting. This is very clearly intentional, because not only are the stars meant to be cryptic, but one of these puzzle pieces comes from a level called Irreversible. I mean, come on, Blow had to be proud of that one. The most infamous star in the game comes from the second level, a level about moving clouds. Near the end of the stage, you'll see a lone cloud just sitting there, except it's moving, just incredibly slowly. If you enter this level from the right, and wait, 2 hours later, you will be able to reach a star. 2 whole hours. I think this is fucking amazing. The game actively takes away any worth from the collectibles by making them so obtuse that even finding out they exist is a challenge. The only worth they really have is what you assign to them once you know they exist. People have complained about these stars a lot online, but that's sort of the point. You don't need the stars. The game actively doesn't want you to get them all. And this is evidenced further by the last one in the game, which involves you manipulating things in the final level just enough to get to the princess's path and now we are all sons of bitches. You have to go so far out of your way for these stars, for no actual gain. It's just the pursuit of completion fueling you if you choose this route. Now, I'm generally a completionist when it comes to games, even in the face of sheer difficulty, even for little reward. But I didn't feel compelled to try and get these stars, because the game worked in a way that made them uncompelling. The narrative and the puzzles were the focus, showing off the idea of a pursuit gone too far to a harmful degree, and the pursuit of these stars ends up a level above that. I respect this choice a lot. I respect this game a lot. Pretentious? Maybe, but it's worth it regardless of whether that word is accurate or not. So it's crazy that I hate The Witness, right? It's a game made by the same guy with the same goals. It features so many things that I should find engaging, but I don't. So what's different here? Let's talk about the audio logs first. Do they fit? That's genuinely me asking, by the way. It's hard for me to even tell. They clearly have some meaning to Blow and/or his team, otherwise they wouldn't be here, but does the game itself justify them being here? There's a lot of variety in these logs, talking about philosophy and symbolism, faith, science, observation. Braid had a story and a message that justified its inclusion of references. But what is the Witness's message, and does it justify these? Well, nobody knows for sure what the point of The Witness is. It's not a game that makes anything clear, and theories about how this game works tend to conflict with each other. I don't think it's by default bad that the game is unclear. Not every game has to have a definite point. But when a game has this much in play and leaves everything up to pure interpretation, to the point where even this game's endings can play zero role in how people look at this game, it feels like maybe things should be a bit more purposeful. The entire visual design of the island is incredibly deliberate, certain angles giving you the perspective to solve puzzles, All of these statues and structures which reveal interesting visuals from the right place. It almost feels like the logs were just put there for the sake of it. I will admit, I'm not someone who was likely to get anything from them anyway, the two exceptions being this one, where extremely horny language is used to describe boating, where I felt confused.
And as I rose upon the stroke,
What the fuck? And the ones in the caves where the curtain is drawn back a bit, in a way that kind of implies that the people behind these audio logs, and this island existing in general, believe that there's a higher purpose to all this in a way that is never said explicitly. They just feel less important than they should, considering the fact that they are one of the only ways the game communicates with us directly. We should be able to glean more things from them about this world, but they seem like separate ideas just added in. And what really gets me here is that Jonathan Blow has talked about the fact that he sees games as art. A lot of what The Witness does seems like Jonathan trying to show that games can be true art. But how come games aren't art? Game development is inherently an artistic medium. People are involved in creating things, bringing a vision to life, crafting an experience for people to see, play, hear, live through. Super Mario Bros. Is art. A team of developers making the most of now outdated hardware to create a fun experience for people, something that built up into an insanely successful franchise. Celeste is art. It tells an engaging story in a way that allows the player to sink into the headspace of its lead character, utilizing gameplay to further its message and see the struggle faced. Really, any game is art. With probably only a few exceptions, every game is going to have at least one person out there who truly got something from the experience, even if it was just enjoyment for a short amount of time, or a developer who really felt like they made a difference with their work. I can see why some games might be harder to think of as art, games that feel like cash grabs, devoid of purpose, games that try to mislead you for monetary gain, but even in those cases, I'm sure there are going to be people out there with deep connections to these titles. Things in a creative medium are going to mean something to someone out there, whether it be games, paintings, sketches, music, abstract ideas, even buildings. So much fits under the umbrella of human creativity. And if you think I'm going to say anything positive about AI imagery here, you're dead wrong. Art is what we, as people, create. It's how we express something, anything. So when Jonathan Blow said that he wants his games to show that games can be true art, it heavily implies that he thinks other people aren't doing that. That the idea of something being considered art means that a very high bar needs to be met, and that if this bar isn't met, then it isn't true art. Not only that, but his games hit that bar while other games don't. When a work is created by someone with such a restricted view of what art is, in a way that comes off as if they're putting themselves on a pedestal above many other works, does that not sound pretentious? That's a big factor in why these extra bits just feel wrong to me. It feels like they meet a purpose that sends a message that I can't find myself accepting as justified. Similar can be said about the theatre in the windmill. See, I did come back to it. There are 6 films, relating to similar themes that the audio logs do. It's possible that you'll watch these and feel inspiration, intrigue, answers to questions. But most of all, that's a circle. There are a few environmental puzzles hidden in these films, all requiring a bit of forward planning to get right, because these are moving images after all. The one that is the most notable is the one in the 4th film, a film that is unlocked by Hugh. By beating the challenge, you gain access to the Secret of Psalm 46, an hour-long lecture that mostly discusses the nature of searching for secrets, conspiracies, patterns, starting by going over Easter eggs in video games, and eventually discussing the theory of Shakespeare being involved in writing the King James Bible, due to what could be seen as a coincidence in the fact that Psalm 46 has the 46th word from the beginning being shake, and the 46th word from the end being spear. And Shakespeare would have been about 46 around the time this was all written down. I can't say I buy into the theory, but that's not really important. The thing I want to discuss is the secret of the film, an environmental puzzle that lasts the full runtime of the film. The moon goes across the screen, starting as a starting point, and right at the end, taking the form as an ending to this line. You have to sit through this whole film to complete it. It is the one thing that has bothered me the most about this game all these years. It's been discussed quite a lot, usually disparagingly, so I know it's not just me that feels strongly about it. And now that I've actually done it, I know how to explain why. First of all, this is a lecture about a topic that, while it discusses interesting topics on the surface, and allows us to ponder the nature of curiosity and understanding, I think it's obvious to say that this won't appeal to everyone. But there's also the fact that it won't appeal to as many people when they are in the process of trying to complete a video game. I feel like the type of people who would be most intrigued by a talk like this would be the type to experience it outside of the world of a game, rather than inside. It clearly affected Jonathan Blow, but I'm not really someone who has much to gain from it. So having to sit down and listen to it for this puzzle bored me more than anything else. By the time it was getting close to over, I felt frustrated for putting myself through this, and finally felt a positive emotion again when the film ended, allowing me to complete the path. This wasn't the last one I had to get to 100% the game, so I should address the elephant in the room, especially considering what I said about Braid. I went ahead and got all of the environmental puzzles in the game. I solved every puzzle that was there, even the ones that didn't give me any benefit. Why? Why did I do that here, but not in Braid? Well, remember, Braid discouraged us from getting 100% through its story and one set of collectibles basically being so obtuse that they could be missed completely. The Witness is much more blatant when it comes to telling us what is available in the game. Despite never being completely direct, it points us heavily towards having the realization that these hidden puzzles are around, through the mountain, but also through a clear understanding of human beings having pattern recognition, and being able to notice things that feel familiar to us. Have you ever seen a face while looking at a car? That's pattern recognition. We're looking for what we're used to seeing. So when the Witness makes these hidden puzzles into something that we should become aware of before the main game ends, and even on the save screen keeps track of how many puzzles of both kinds we have solved, the completion is what you make of it argument falls a bit more flat, especially since it's quite easy to complete a majority of these puzzles. Ones like the ones in Psalm 46 are outliers, and I don't feel like outliers are enough to present a big message about completionism here. The game is telling you what full completion is. The game hides these things here, wanting you to find them. The single panel on the mountain that looks like the river is proof that they weren't ever just going to be a hidden thing that only the most observant would find. The game wants you to know they're there. See them, find them. At that point, why would someone who wants to complete the games they play do anything less? And yes, on a fundamental level, there is nothing that explicitly says you have to do this. I can complain about so much of this game and here, but that's not required. And that's true, but the game puts this stuff here. The game wants it to be found. And if that all wasn't proof enough that the game wants us to find all of this stuff, then what about? I've talked about going through the game with a new perspective a few times already. It's the core of that finding out new secrets hidden in the game thing. Going through old areas now that you have reason to be looking for hidden lines. There's one line in the game that stands out more than any other as a result of this. Going through the caves will lead us to the challenge, and also allow us to access other areas in the game more easily. The town, the desert, the marsh, all have different shortcuts through this underground area. But there's one thing that stands out that I haven't brought up. A hidden secret. Like with the vault doors that gave us the codes for movies in the theatre, we get shown a grid with symbols on it. One that we can't do anything with. Maybe it's worth writing it down. Exploring the game for long enough, we'll eventually end up finding hidden secrets in the beginning area. I do think that these lines tend to be cool, since you wouldn't even come close to thinking about looking for them at this point. But now they seem so obvious. You also see a panel, with the same shape as the one in the note, without any symbols though. But what if there are symbols? If we treat this panel as if the symbols are there, they're triangles, we know these well, the gate closes again. Seems pretty weird until we step back. The sun, more than just a deadly laser, is in fact the start of a hidden line. Tracing it, the game starts to shake. Reality is breaking down. This could have been the third puzzle we ever solved, but we didn't even know to look for it. This is the wow moment of the game for me. This exact moment, right here, realizing that one of the first things we ever spotted in the game holds a secret. It's really cool. It's what gets me about knowledge-based unlocks. The wow moment does not hold though. As we go through the new area, we see parts of the island, different rooms transporting us to completely different areas. We're in the sky, now we're in the caves, now the sky again. This place does not exist in reality. We receive credits for those involved with the game, something that wouldn't happen if this was meant to be a real environment. We eventually reach this long, empty path, edging closer to the end, to be met with This is the end of The Witness, a 7.5 minute long video, in first person perspective, of someone who seems to be waking up from a dreamlike state, detaching themselves from machinery, and adjusting back to the real world. Is the witness all a dream? Is it a simulation? What's the purpose of the island? Who is this person? Why are puzzle panels hung up around this dwelling? Did they create the world, or are they just testing it? None of these questions really receive an answer, despite the fact that this seems like the canon ending. I say that because of the hotel leading up to it, and the fact that the game does just stop at the end of it. You see the person interact with the real world, trying to activate the circles that they encounter, like in the game, until they eventually lay down, and the screen fades to blue, and closes. The more important question is, does any of this even fucking matter? The only real things I can glean from this are that yes, Jonathan Blow does have a bottle of piss, but also that the game is aware that if you're told to look for symbols that look like circles with lines coming out of them, then you're probably gonna notice when you see a symbol that looks like a circle with a line coming out of it. Oh god. This game seems to be, in part, about perspective, but it doesn't really feel like there's a message in saying, now you're going to see the thing that you saw. Like, yeah, that's how our brains work. Looking for more answers honestly feels like a waste of time, for me at least. Because what is an answer even going to do for me at this point? If I find something, I'm going to think that might be what Jonathan Blow intended. It also might not be. I'm a completely different person with a different viewpoint. Does all of this feed into the witness's purpose? Maybe. I don't know. I'm at the point where I look at all of this extra content outside of the core gameplay, and all I can really think is just, I don't care. I don't care, and I don't think it matters that I don't. My experience with the game is mainly about solving the puzzles. That's why I came to it in the first place. That's why I tried to stick with the game despite my issues with it. Everything that's here otherwise gives me nothing. I'm not going to suddenly change my opinion of the entire game through some deeper understanding of the context of it. That won't change the experience I had, the one that I'm still having. We all give different value to the different parts of video games, and a lot of the value I give to a game indeed comes from the experience I had playing it. So when I get the chance to look the final 13 minutes of nostalgia by Tarkovsky within The Witness, that's not going to make me love the game. It's not going to unlock a part of my mind, teach me something. I'm going to think, I don't have any reason to do this. I can do this on my own time. I'm playing this for something else. I do not feel like I really gained anything from The Witness, but after this last time playing it, I feel like there wasn't really a reason for me to. I went in wanting to experience a puzzle game, and I finished it experiencing a puzzle game. The only difference between these two states is that my view upon starting was that I was going to enjoy myself, and my view upon ending was that I truly didn't. That's why I 100%ed it. That's why I've come back to it so many times over the years. I've wanted to feel like I've gotten something out of this game, and it's taken me this long to fully realize that I just won't. It's not going to happen suddenly. The Witness felt like a game that expected me to be thinking of it from a certain perspective, to see the things it did differently as profound, to be wowed by puzzles that annoyed me as a result of obfuscation of simplicity. And especially when a main point of this game seems to be about how perspective can affect things, I don't really understand why the things are seen as okay. It's a game that I've wanted to like, since I've loved so many games that are somewhat like it, but it actively made it difficult for me to feel that way. It's a game with clear flaws in accessibility that shouldn't be excused. It's a game that felt like it wanted me to dislike it, because for every moment where I said wow, there were plenty more where I said why. But in the end, that's just my perspective. If you played The Witness and found it fantastic, maybe even the best gaming experience you've ever had, that's fine. We are two different people. You may look for different things than I do when it comes to a gaming experience. You may have found the audio logs very thoughtful, or learnt something about yourself through solving these puzzles. You may have even largely ignored the puzzles, just focusing on the world around you and appreciating its beauty, and gaining something from that. I just really can't see myself agreeing. I can't bring myself to like The Witness. There's just too much in the game stopping me from being able to do that. So thank you for watching if you did. This is a video that honestly I've wanted to make for about 7 years now, and I've only recently been able to figure out the words. Feel free to like and subscribe, maybe even comment. It helped me know that people felt some type of way about the thing I made. Well, that's all from me. I'm gonna go witness some bitches. See ya.